Hey guys, tonight we begin with a topic so fundamental, so universal, and yet so rarely discussed in polite company that it almost feels sacred. We're diving into what going to the bathroom was really like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry. Hollywood sold you the pristine, shining fable. The truth is you probably wouldn't last a single day without desperately searching for a discreet bush, or at least a very, very strong scented candle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1325. You're lying on a straw mattress which, if you're lucky, isn't actively crawling with too many things. The air is cold, damp, and smells faintly of wood smoke, old sweat, and whatever livestock decided to bunk indoors for the night. No amount of soft background humming, or even heavy background humming, is going to change the fact that nature is calling. And it's not calling politely. No, it's screaming a guttural, undeniable demand. This, my friend, is where your modern-day bladder, accustomed to porcelain thrones and the gentle flush of anonymity, starts to panic. Because in medieval Europe, there's no bathroom down the hall, no ensuite, no mildly resentful plunger in the corner, no soothing scent of potpourri to mask the existential dread. The call of nature in the Middle Ages is an adventure, a social experiment, and often a surprisingly public event. Imagine this. You swing your legs out of bed. Your bare feet hit compacted dirt, possibly wet from last night's leaky thatched roof, possibly crusty from something the goat left behind. The first thing you notice, even before the chill seeps into your bones, is the need. It's urgent, it's undeniable, and you need to go. Your home, probably a one-room wooden hut, offers all the privacy of a bird's nest. Your entire family, parents, siblings, maybe a random cousin who just never left, are stirring nearby. They'll notice. Everyone notices everything. There's no quiet slip to the loo. Every rustle, every shuffle, every muffled sigh is communal property. So, with a sigh of your own, you grab the nearest vessel, usually a wooden bucket or a ceramic pot known as a chamber pot. This, my friend, is your primary interface with medieval sanitation. And let me tell you, it's about to get very up close and personal. The chamber pot wasn't a luxury item, it was a necessity. Every household, from the humblest peasant hut to the grandest castle, though they'd have fancier ones, probably with a little handle for dignity, possessed at least one, if not several. These were your late-night lifelines, your morning necessities, your quiet despair. You'd position it with the practiced grace of someone performing an awkward ballet. There's no comfortable seat, no backrest. It's a squat, a crouch, a silent prayer that you don't miss. And once the deed is done, the problem begins. The pot is now full, and it's going to stay full until someone, usually whoever drew the short straw that morning, empties it. Now, if you're a peasant in a village, the emptying process is straightforward, if not exactly pleasant. You'd carry your fragrant burden outside, trying not to slosh. Where do you empty it? Well, usually onto the nearest dung heap or into a designated communal pit. In some villages, it was simply out the door and into the street. Yes, the street. This is where things start to get interesting, or rather, disgusting. Imagine yourself making your way through the narrow, unpaved lanes of a medieval village. The ground is a patchwork of mud, straw, and whatever else has been casually discarded. And then there's the effluent. Human waste, animal droppings, food scraps, discarded straw, all mingling in a rich, malodorous stew. This wasn't an oversight. This was normal. This was just life. The concept of a centralised sewage system was, for most of the Middle Ages, simply non-existent. Or rather, it existed only in the abstract sense that everything eventually flowed downhill, or was occasionally washed away by a truly heroic rainstorm. So while your chamber pot solved the immediate problem within the confines of your humble abode, it simply relocated that problem a few feet away, adding to the perpetually fragrant ambience of the medieval street. Now, if village life sounds charmingly rustic in its filth, let's talk about the medieval town. Here, the scale of the problem amplifies into something truly monumental. Towns and cities, packed densely with people, animals, and commerce, were vibrant hubs of life. they were also vibrant hubs of everything else. The streets weren't just for walking, they were open sewers. Sometimes they even had a charming little trench running down the middle, aptly named the kennel, or gully, whose purpose was to collect the runoff from chamber pots, kitchen slop and butcher's waste. This created a perpetually flowing, glistening river of rejection that meandered through the heart of the community. You're walking down the street, maybe to market, maybe to church, perhaps just trying to avoid eye contact with that suspiciously enthusiastic pig. Suddenly, a window above you creaks open, and a voice shouts, "Gardez-l'eau!" That, my friend, is Old French for "Gardez-l'eau." Watch out for the water, it was the polite, or perhaps sarcastically polite, warning shout before someone emptied their chamber pot directly out the window and onto the street below. Yes, this was a normal, legal, and common practice. Imagine trying to navigate a narrow alleyway, dodging not just carts and stray dogs, but actively flowing human waste and the occasional airborne projectile from above. It made urban strolls a constant game of skill, agility, and a general willingness to accept a high level of splatter. Laws, when they existed, were often more aspirational than enforced. Some city ordinances might fine you for not shouting "Gardez-l'eau," or for dumping solid waste during the day. But the sheer volume of output meant that civic authorities were fighting a losing battle against the tide of human effluent. This constant layer of filth wasn't just a nuisance, it was a primary vector for disease. Flies buzzed, rats scurried, and the air hung thick with unseen pathogens. While medieval people didn't understand germ theory, they certainly understood that living in proximity to their own waste often led to unpleasant outcomes like dysentery, cholera, and a general sense of being perpetually unwell. So, the urban dweller developed a certain nose blindness, a highly practical if not exactly appealing adaptation to living in a perpetually odorous environment. In this delightful landscape of casual open-air elimination, there emerged a crucial, if highly undesirable profession, the gong farmer. No, they didn't farm gongs. A gong in medieval English was a privy or outhouse, so a gong farmer was a person whose job it was to empty cesspits. These were the unsung heroes of urban sanitation, the people who plunged into the depths of accumulated human waste, often with little more than a shovel and a strong constitution. It was a job considered so vile that they were only allowed to work after dark, under strict regulations, and often had to live outside the city walls. They were probably the only people in medieval society who actively wanted to smell less terrible than everyone else. Imagine the absolute, soul-destroying horror of this work, wading into centuries of accumulated waste, battling the stench, the vermin, the sheer putrefaction. It was dirty, dangerous, methane gas poisoned many, and thankless work, yet absolutely vital to keeping medieval towns from drowning in their own refuse. These were not jobs people sought out for career advancement. They were often passed down through families, a grim inheritance, or taken by those with truly no other options. So, next time you casually flush a toilet, spare a thought for the gong farmer. He's the real reason you don't have to wade through a river of medieval effluent to get to your avocado toast. Surely in the grand, fortified walls of a castle, life was more civilized, right? Well, sort of. While castles might have looked imposing on the outside, their internal plumbing systems, while an improvement, still left a lot to be desired. The most common form of castle lavatory was the garderobe. Now this sounds very fancy, very French, very elegant. In reality, a garderobe was little more than a small projection from the castle wall, containing a hole in the stone seat, and through that hole, a straight unfiltered drop directly down, usually into the moat or into a cesspit at the base of the castle wall. On the one hand, this was a massive step up from the chamber pot and the open street. Waste was immediately removed from the living quarters. On the other hand, it turned the moat into a literal ring of sewage, which, while probably effective as a deterrent to invaders, who wants to swim through that, meant the scent of the castle was, shall we say, distinctive. And yes, the legends are true. Attackers sometimes attempted to infiltrate castles via the waste chute. Talk about entering through the back door, indeed. It was a desperate, filthy, and probably ill-advised tactic, but the fact that it was even attempted tells you something about the limited options available for breaking into a well-defended medieval fortress. Inside the castle, the garderobes provided a modicum of privacy compared to the communal chamber pots of the peasantry. but they were often cold, drafty, and still incredibly smelly, especially in summer. The constant airflow through the chute, while designed to carry odours away, could just as easily carry them in, depending on the wind direction. So, while the Lord had a dedicated place to do his business, it was far from a spa experience. It's interesting to note that the term garderobe literally translates to guarding robes, or wardrobe. Scholars debate whether these facilities were sometimes used to store clothes, as the constant draft of ammonia from the waste chute might have deterred fleas and other vermin. Perhaps it made your clothes smell less of mothballs and more of, well, ammonia and sewage. A medieval trade-off indeed. So, while the nobles might have had a slightly more sophisticated setup, the fundamental reality of waste disposal remained grim and undeniably smelly. Their gold-embroidered garments still absorbed the ambient bouquet of the castle. Having addressed the urgent call of nature and the ingenious, if disgusting, methods of disposal, a question inevitably arises: the wiping. And this, my friends, is where our medieval ancestors truly diverge from our modern, plush, multiply sensibilities. There was, of course, no toilet paper, not in the way we know it. The concept of a soft, perforated roll of papery goodness was light years away. So, what did they use? The answer varies wildly depending on who you were, where you were, and how desperate the situation. For the vast majority of people, common peasants and villagers, natural materials were the go-to. Think moss, soft, absorbent, relatively plentiful in forested areas, or leaves, broad leaves, ideally from a non-irritating plant. Trial and error here was probably a painful learning curve. Rags were another option, scraps of old cloth, probably not washed frequently between uses. This starts to paint a rather vivid and slightly alarming picture of hygiene. For those slightly better off, or in specific regions, straw or hay could be employed. Imagine the scratchiness, the splintery bits, the absolutely zero give. One wonders if it was more abrasive than cleaning. Then there were the truly utilitarian options, sticks, and even, on occasion, your hand. Yes, your hand. Which again brings us back to the crucial point of hand hygiene, or the complete and utter lack thereof. This alone explains why handshakes, as a widely accepted social greeting, took a very long time to become popular. You didn't want to know where that hand had been. In cultures with access to water, particularly in parts of the Islamic world, the use of water for cleansing was common, a practice that horrified much of medieval Christian Europe, which equated such cleanliness with paganism or even heresy. This stark cultural difference played a significant role in the general unhygienic state of European society. Even among the very rich, the options weren't exactly luxurious. While they might have scented cloths or fine linen scraps, the fundamental method of physical cleansing remained rather crude. The notion of a perfectly clean posterior was less a goal and more a distant, unreachable dream. This constant, unavoidable level of bodily uncleanliness seeped into everything: clothing, food preparation, social interaction. It informed their understanding of comfort, of health, and of what constituted a normal day. So next time you see that perfectly preserved medieval tapestry, or a painting of a noble lady, just remember, beneath the silks and the solemn expressions, there was a reality of constant itching, unidentifiable odours, and a distinct lack of proper wiping. History, as it turns out, is full of sticky situations. Now that you've managed the morning's essential task and dealt with the question of the wipe, what's next on your daily medieval routine? A refreshing shower, a leisurely bath with scented oils, a vigorous session with a toothbrush. Sorry, wrong century. In medieval times, personal hygiene was less about feeling fresh and more about not actively repelling everyone around you. A goal that was often, how shall we say, aspirational. Let's talk about bathing. For most of the Middle Ages, especially after the fall of the Roman Empire and before the peak of the Renaissance, personal bathing was largely an occasional affair, and for good reason, according to medieval knowledge. People actually believed that bathing, especially with hot water, opened your pores and let disease-carrying bad air or miasma directly into your body. That's right. Washing yourself was considered medically risky. You were apparently cleaner, and certainly safer, if you never removed the protective layer of filth caked onto your skin. It was your natural God-given armour against the plague. so full body washes were infrequent at best. Maybe a dip in a cold stream once in a while during summer, if you were feeling particularly bold. For the vast majority, daily cleaning involved perhaps wiping their face and hands with a damp cloth, if water was readily available and not actively trying to kill you. The logistical challenge was also immense. Hauling water from a well or river, heating it over a fire which required precious firewood and labour, and then pouring it into a wooden tub which probably leaked, was a full-day production. It wasn't a casual affair, it was an event. Communal bathhouses did exist, particularly in some cities, and especially after the Crusades when exposure to Middle Eastern practices sparked renewed interest. These could be bustling social hubs, places for gossip, business, and yes, sometimes full-on medieval extracurriculars. Naturally, the church, ever concerned with public morals and often suspicious of naked gatherings, eventually frowned upon them, leading to their decline in many areas. So if you were hoping for a quick communal soak, you were often out of luck. This led to various forms of dry bathing. This wasn't some sophisticated spa treatment. It typically involved vigorously rubbing your body down with a dry cloth or a brush to remove loose dirt and dead skin. For those a bit more fastidious, or perhaps preparing for a rare social engagement, scented herbs or oils might be applied on top of the existing grime to mask the prevailing odours. In essence, it was less about getting clean and more about perfecting the art of smelling slightly better than a barnyard animal. Your medieval self was perpetually encased in a protective, if rather pungent, layer of accumulated daily life. Now that you're freshly bathed, it's time to flash that morning smile, except you don't. Because in the Middle Ages, smiling is a dangerous game, not emotionally, but dentally. There's no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no floss. The concept of oral hygiene is about as popular as regular bathing, which is to say, not very. Some people might chew on a twig or rinse with wine or vinegar, but for the most part your teeth are on their own and they're definitely not doing well. By the time you hit your mid-20s, your smile looks like something pulled from a haunted crypt. Cavities are rampant, gums are swollen, and those aren't just food stains on your teeth. That's decay, plain and simple. You have more rot in your mouth than a medieval root cellar. While sugar wasn't the ubiquitous culprit it is today, it was a rare, expensive luxury, a diet heavy in coarse, gritty bread, fermented grains, and unwashed root vegetables took its toll. Toothaches? Get used to them. They're like medieval weather, always there in the background, a constant throb that makes you consider praying, drinking heavily, or pulling the tooth out yourself with a pair of pliers. And that's not a joke. That was often the actual treatment. Dentists didn't really exist as a profession, but barber surgeons certainly did. Yes, the same guy who gives you a haircut might also pull your molars out by candlelight with an iron hook and zero anaesthesia. You were lucky if he'd had a clean shave himself that day. An infected tooth? Hope you like fevers, because without antibiotics it can easily turn into sepsis and kill you. It's a sobering thought. The same thing that sends us to a pharmacy today could be your funeral in the 1300s, and there's no relief on the social front either. Kissing? Good luck. Halitosis, or bad breath, is everywhere. If you're single, you're not judged by your smile, you're judged by your land and your livestock. In short, your mouth is a battlefield, and it's losing the war. If your scalp wasn't a constant battlefield, you were doing it wrong. Infrequent washing combined with close living quarters and the abundance of farm animals meant that head lice and fleas weren't exceptions. They were constant companions. Everyone had them. Nobles with their elaborate coiffures, lousy monks in their robes, itchy children, peasants, soldiers. Basically, you were a walking insect farm and no one escaped. You'd be scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while chatting with the local priest, and no one would even bat an eye. It was just normal. Hairstyling was typically simple and practical, usually kept short or braided to minimise tangles and, ironically, to make it easier for the vermin to move around. The emphasis was less on aesthetics and more on basic management. The implications for comfort and health were constant: incessant itching, skin irritations, and a general background level of misery from a permanent, unwelcome ecosystem residing in your hair and on your skin. Medieval barbers might use fine-toothed combs to try and remove some of the larger inhabitants, but actual eradication was basically impossible. So, your hair effectively became a den of vermin, a constant low-level assault that added to the endless discomfort of medieval daily life. With the almost complete lack of soap, no deodorant and heavy woolen clothing that was worn for months on end without washing, body odour wasn't just a personal issue, it was a defining characteristic of medieval society. The air of medieval Europe was a fragrant symphony of human sweat, animal musk, wood smoke, old beer, and general bodily effluvia. While some attempts were made to combat this, they were more about masking than truly cleaning. Nobles might carry pomanders, small perforated balls filled with powerfully scented herbs like civet, ambergris, or civet, to occasionally sniff and create a temporary if artificial personal aura. Herbs might be tucked into clothing, or primitive perfumes dabbed on, but these were largely ineffective against the prevailing miasma. The sheer ubiquity of strong odours meant that people developed a form of societal nose blindness. You couldn't smell it because everyone smelled it. It was part of the background noise of life. The very few people who did try to stay clean, either through religious vows or unusual personal habits, probably stood out like a freshly laundered linen shirt in a pigsty. It was normal, it was accepted. It was just how life was lived. So next time you complain about your roommate's questionable laundry habits, remember that at least they're not fermenting in their own stench for 6 months straight. So you've navigated the treacherous waters of medieval personal hygiene, which, let's be honest, means you're mostly still as grubby as you were when you woke up, just slightly more aware of it. Now your stomach begins its own insistent rumbling, a hunger that isn't just about needing nourishment, but about needing fuel to survive another day in this relentlessly uncomfortable era. And your only option is the medieval diet, a truly wondrous tapestry of repetition, scarcity, and questionable culinary choices. Forget the romanticised images of grand feasts with roasted swans and overflowing goblets. For the vast majority of medieval society, the peasants, the very backbone of civilization, meals were not a celebration. They were a means to an end, and that end was basic survival. The cornerstone of your daily intake would be grain, not the artisanal, gluten-free sprouted grain of today. Oh no, we're talking coarse, unrefined, and often gritty rye, barley, oats, or wheat, if you were very lucky. This grain would be turned into two things: bread and pottage. The bread was not your friend. It was dense, dark, and often quite hard. Sometimes, if the harvest was poor, it would be bulked up with less appetizing ingredients: sawdust, ground acorns, or even clay. Yes, clay. You didn't slice this bread, you negotiated with it. It served as your plate, your spoon, and your primary source of calories. Imagine chewing on a brick, but a brick that vaguely resembled bread and felt just as resistant. And then there was pottage. This was the ultimate medieval comfort food, provided your definition of comfort included a thick, gloopy stew made from whatever was available, constantly simmering in the same pot, sometimes for days or even weeks. New ingredients were simply dumped on top of the old ones. It was less a recipe and more an ongoing edible experiment. Root vegetables like turnips, always with the turnips, onions and cabbages would form the base. Beans and peas, if available, would add some much-needed protein. Meat? Dream on. That was for Sundays, feast days, or if you managed to poach something and not get caught, which, remember, could get you hanged. If you were a common peasant, you ate meat only a few times a year. When you did, it was usually salted, dried, or smoked to preserve it, and likely had been hanging for a few days, attracting flies. Fresh meat was a rare, precious commodity. As for fresh fruits and vegetables, only when they were in season, and only if they hadn't already been eaten by animals or fermented into something else. Spices, the kind we casually sprinkle on everything today, were worth more than gold. A pinch of pepper could cost more than your monthly wages. So, flavour came from onions, salt, if you were lucky enough to have access to this precious commodity, and pain. Most meals tasted to a modern palate like wet burlap sprinkled with sadness. Water, as we discussed, was generally unsafe, so you'd wash down your gritty bread and gloopy pottage with beer. Not the strong craft brew you're imagining. This was small beer, weak in alcohol content, but safer to drink than the local well water, which teemed with microscopic horrors. Kids drank it too. No one was happy about it, but at least it wouldn't kill you immediately. Eating in the Middle Ages was a gamble. Every bite was a risk. But you ate anyway, because in medieval times food didn't nourish, it tested you. And if you woke up the next morning still breathing and not actively spewing your guts out, you won the gamble. for today at least. Having filled your stomach with roughly hewn sustenance, let's consider another fundamental building block of medieval society that was surprisingly also intensely practical, often unromantic, and occasionally a genetic lottery: the medieval wedding. Forget everything you've seen in fairy tales. While there might have been a bit of feasting, for the nobility anyway, and certainly some very uncomfortable new clothes, medieval weddings were less about happily ever after and more about strategic alliances, or, as we've learned, about keeping it in the family, genetically and politically. For royalty and nobility, marriage was a transaction, a contract, a merger between two powerful families designed to consolidate land, secure titles, or forge military alliances. Love was a bonus, a happy accident, delightful if it occurred, but entirely secondary to the strategic imperative. So the bride and groom often met for the first time days before the wedding, sizing each other up like potential business partners, which effectively they were. The concept of marrying for love was largely unheard of, or at least confined to the silly ballads sung by travelling minstrels, who were almost certainly making it up for tips. Parental consent was paramount, and often children were betrothed from infancy, their futures mapped out before they could walk, let alone understand the concept of a shared family tree. These alliances often meant marrying blood relatives, cousins, second cousins, sometimes even uncles and nieces. If the political advantages were strong enough, the moral or biological concerns could be politely overlooked. The church had rules against marrying too closely, but dispensations could be bought, especially for powerful families. A papal dispensation was basically a get-out-of-inbreeding free card, available for a modest fee, of course. The wedding ceremony itself was surprisingly simple compared to modern extravaganzas. Often, it involved little more than a public declaration of consent, typically outside the church door, followed by a blessing from a priest. The exchange of rings was common, a symbol of commitment. The feast, if there was one, followed. For peasants, it was a modest affair, perhaps an extra piece of meat, a bit more ale and some dancing. For the wealthy, it was a multi-day event of consumption, display, and very bad table manners. The morning after was often marked by the morning gift, a present from the groom to the bride, symbolising his appreciation and her entry into his family. And then, the new couple would begin their life together, usually with the goal of producing heirs as quickly as possible. Infant mortality was tragically high, so having many children was a matter of dynastic survival. This constant pressure to produce boys, healthy boys, was a grim backdrop to many royal marriages and often formed the earliest cracks in the occasional facade of affection. So while tales of knights saving princesses might fill the storybooks, the truth of medieval marriage was much more grounded. It was a bond of blood, land, and the relentless pursuit of dynastic security. And if, in the midst of all that strategic planning and genetic mingling, a bit of genuine affection blossomed, well, that was just a happy accident, easily overlooked in the grand scheme of things. Having settled into the marital arrangement a la medieval, let's pivot to another fascinating, utterly bizarre, and occasionally terrifying aspect of daily medieval life: the animals. Forget the friendly farm creatures, the fluffy kittens, and the noble steeds of legend. In the Middle Ages, animals were everywhere, intimate parts of your existence, sources of food, labour, and a constant, very real threat. And their existence was understood through the lens of something truly strange: the bestiary. A bestiary was a book, a medieval encyclopedia of beasts, both real and imaginary. But it wasn't a scientific text as we understand it today. Oh no, it was a moral and theological treatise designed to teach lessons about God, the devil, and human nature through the behaviour, real or imagined, of animals. So, a lion wasn't just a big cat, it symbolised Christ. A fox wasn't just cunning, it represented the devil's trickery. And some of the creatures within its pages were, well, let's just say zoology wasn't their strong suit. Imagine living in a world where you truly believed that a unicorn, a fierce, pure creature that could only be tamed by a virgin naturally, might roam the deep forests, or that a griffin, half eagle, half lion, guardian of treasure, was a distinct possibility in the far-off mountains. These weren't just myths, they were part of the accepted natural world, and if you encountered one, well, the bestiary probably had a suitable moral lesson for you. But the real animals were often just as perplexing, if not more dangerous than the mythical ones. Your relationship with them was profoundly different from ours today. Your most intimate contact was with farm animals. They lived in very close proximity. Often in winter, cattle, sheep, and even pigs and chickens would share your one-room hut. Yes, you heard that right. This wasn't because you loved their companionship, it was for their warmth. A cow is a surprisingly effective, if odorous, heat generator. So you snuggled up with Bessie and Henrietta, ignoring the smells, the occasional nudge, and the very real chance of stepping in something nasty first thing in the morning. Their body heat was crucial for surviving the brutal medieval winters. They were also chattel. Every animal had a purpose. Cows provided milk, if you could keep it from spoiling, butter and cheese. Oxen were beasts of burden, pulling ploughs. Sheep provided wool for your scratchy single outfit. Pigs were walking lard factories, valuable for their meat which could be salted and preserved. Chickens provided eggs, assuming a fox or a starving neighbour didn't get to them first. Every animal was an investment, a lifeline. Lose a pig to disease or theft, and your family's winter survival just got a whole lot tougher. Beyond the confines of your village, the medieval world teemed with truly wild animals, and they were not your friends. Wolves were a constant terror, preying on livestock and occasionally unwary travellers or children. Bears roamed the forests. Wild boars, fiercely aggressive, could gore a man with terrifying ease. These weren't creatures to admire from a distance at a zoo. They were forces of nature, symbols of the untamed wilderness, and a very real threat to your livelihood and life. Hunting was not a sport for the common peasant. Game animals, deer, boar, rabbits, were typically the property of the local lord. Poaching, taking anything that breathed on the lord's land, was a serious crime, punishable by brutal fines, mutilation, or even death. So, while your stomach rumbled and a fat deer grazed just beyond your meagre fields, it was a tempting, but often forbidden, meal. The medieval mind also understood animals through their perceived symbolism. A deer escaping a hunt might be a sign from God. A raven cawing at your window might be an omen of death. Animals were part of the spiritual landscape, reflections of divine will or diabolical influence. This holistic view of the natural world, infused with moral lessons and spiritual significance, shaped daily interactions in ways we can barely comprehend today. So, while we might view animals through a lens of companionship or scientific study, your medieval counterpart saw them as sources of warmth, labour, food, a moral compass, and a constant, unpredictable danger. They were a vivid, visceral part of every hour of every day, and their presence left a lasting impression on the very fabric of medieval life. And maybe, just maybe, the belief in unicorns made the pig sharing your hut a little less depressing. So, you've eaten your questionable pottage, said your goodbyes to the chamber pot for now, and waved to your bovine housemates. Now, let's consider your physical self, that vessel navigating this delightful medieval landscape, your body. It was, shall we say, a constant work in progress, a living, breathing testament to hard labour, poor nutrition, and a medical science that was, well, let's just charitably call it experimental. In contrast to our modern obsession with peak performance and perfectly sculpted physiques, the medieval body was simply a tool for survival. It was expected to endure, to work, to resist, and it was almost certainly a symphony of aches and pains. Imagine waking up every single day with joints creaking like an old wooden door, muscles protesting from dawn to dusk labour, and a general feeling of gnawing exhaustion. That was just Tuesday. The prevailing medical theory was that of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, choler, and black bile, melancholy. These were thought to be the fundamental fluids of the body, and your health, physical and mental, depended on keeping them in perfect balance. Too much of one, too little of another, and boom, you were sick. Or as they might put it, out of whack. Got a fever? Clearly an excess of blood. The solution? Bloodletting. That's right. Let's drain some of that unruly life force into a bowl, using a dull blade or, for the more squeamish, a hungry leech. And yes, barbers were often the ones performing this delicate operation. So you'd go in for a quick trim and leave lightheaded. probably with a few less ounces of yourself, 2 for 1, feeling sad or anxious. That's clearly an excess of black bile. The cure? Laxatives, maybe a warm herbal purge, or just prayers and a cold compress, while everyone avoided eye contact with you and subtly started carving your coffin. Because unfortunately, medieval medicine was often a very elaborate way of saying, you'll probably die from that. If you broke a bone or got a nasty wound, you were in real trouble. There was no anaesthesia, unless you count passing out from sheer pain. Surgery was done with knives that had not been cleaned since the last papal decree, if ever. Tools were heated over fire, not for sterilisation, but presumably because they looked scarier that way. Antibiotics were centuries away. Germ theory. Not invented yet. They thought disease came from bad air, evil spirits, or God being annoyed with your moral failings. Got a stomachache? Must have been your sinful thoughts. Hope you like confessing while vomiting. When a condition got worse, the treatment often involved more leeches, possibly some crushed beetles, for external application hopefully, and a priest at your bedside giving last rites just in case. At this point they were preparing for the cure known as death, and if, by some miracle you recovered, everyone just assumed God took pity on you. The physician took full credit, and the leech got promoted, so yes, in the Middle Ages medicine was less about healing and more about surviving the cure. When we think of childhood today, we imagine playgrounds, education, and boundless potential. In the Middle Ages, childhood was a relentless battle against the odds, a race against disease and early death, and a remarkably short period of actual innocence. Infant mortality was horrifically high. Nearly half of all children born never reached their 5th birthday. Disease, malnutrition, cold, and a general lack of medical understanding meant that simply surviving infancy was a statistical miracle. Parents loved their children fiercely, of course, but there was also a heartbreaking degree of emotional detachment required. You couldn't invest too deeply, for fear of the almost inevitable loss. If you made it past 5, you were considered less a child and more a small, semi-functional adult. Work began early. There was no school, no universal education. Children learned through observation, repetition, and immediate necessity. A small wooden rake might be pressed into a 5-year-old's hand, and they'd be put to work in the fields alongside their parents. Girls learned domestic tasks almost as soon as they could walk, helping with the cooking, caring for younger siblings, spinning wool. Boys learned farming, crafts, or assisted their fathers in whatever trade they pursued. Toys were simple, usually homemade, wooden dolls, carved animals, cloth balls. Play was often a form of practical training, mimicking adult activities. A child who liked throwing rocks might one day be the tribe's best hunter. A girl playing with fabric scraps might become a skilled weaver. Discipline was physical, immediate, and without sentimentality. If a child wandered too close to a cliff, you didn't give them a timeout. You grabbed them by the leg and barked something like, "No fall!" The stakes were too high. Safety rules had to be taught fast. Touching fire, chasing wolves, or trying to eat unknown berries were considered teachable moments, ideally before anything exploded, burned, or caused hallucinations. By the time they were 10 or 12, children were considered semi-functional members of society, capable of contributing significantly to the household economy. Annoying, yes, but now useful. Puberty often meant immediate entry into adulthood, with expectations for marriage, labour, and procreation quickly following. So, while tales of knights saving princesses might fill the storybooks, the truth of medieval childhood was much more grounded. It was a brief, arduous journey through disease, labour, and constant threat, punctuated by moments of simple play and fierce familial bonds. Surviving childhood in the Middle Ages was not a right, but a hard-won victory. Stepping away from the dirt and discomfort of the common medieval folk, let's consider a different kind of medieval existence, one that promised spiritual salvation, intellectual pursuit, and surprisingly a meticulous approach to, well, everything. The monastery. Monasteries were not just places of prayer and contemplation, they were economic powerhouses, centres of learning, and surprisingly innovative hubs. They were self-sufficient communities, often managing vast lands, engaging in crafts, and developing agricultural techniques long before their secular counterparts. If you wanted order, quiet mostly, and hot meals, the monastery offered a tempting alternative to the chaotic brutality outside its walls. Life in a monastery was strictly regulated by a specific rule, most famously the rule of St. Benedict. This dictated every aspect of a monk's or nun's day: when to pray, when to work, when to eat, and even when to be silent. It divided the day into periods of communal prayer, the liturgy of the hours, often 7 times a day, manual labour, farm work, cooking, cleaning, and spiritual reading or study. Compared to the outside world, monasteries offered a remarkably high standard of living. They often had access to cleaner water sources, better food, grown on their own lands, and even rudimentary sanitation. Some monasteries had sophisticated systems of latrines that flushed into rivers, or even early forms of plumbing for washing. The meticulous nature of monastic life spilled over into hygiene. Monks and nuns were certainly cleaner, on average, than the general population, not because of a modern understanding of germs, but because cleanliness was seen as a pathway to godliness and order. However, monastic life was not for the faint of heart. It demanded extreme discipline, sacrifice, and a complete renunciation of the outside world. Silence was often enforced, and personal possessions were forbidden. Meals were austere, prayers were long, and penance was a daily reality. But in exchange, you gained security, a sense of purpose, and intellectual stimulation that was almost impossible to find elsewhere. Monasteries possessed libraries teeming with ancient manuscripts, copied meticulously by hand day in and day out. They preserved classical knowledge during turbulent times and became beacons of literacy and scholarship. Monks and nuns were pioneers in brewing, winemaking, and animal husbandry. Their medicinal gardens were often the most advanced in the region, cultivating herbs and developing treatments that were far more effective than the average barber surgeon's bloodletting. They were in many ways the unacknowledged innovators of the medieval world, subtly shaping society from behind high walls and within the confines of strict adherence to their rules. So, while the image of a solemn monk bent over a flickering candle might seem tedious, the reality offered a profound alternative to the chaotic existence outside. A life of quiet order, scholarly pursuit, and communal support, all for the glory of God, and perhaps the subtle luxury of a slightly cleaner toilet system. Having peeked into the disciplined and marginally cleaner world of the monastery, let us now return to the boisterous, chaotic, and relentlessly malodorous medieval city. If the village was a quiet symphony of smells, the city was a full-blown orchestra, playing at maximum volume 24/7. Medieval cities were fascinating paradoxes. They were centres of trade, innovation, and culture, magnets for ambition and opportunity. People flocked to them for freedom, for work, for escape. But they were also incredibly crowded, incredibly insanitary, and incredibly loud. Imagine a place where every square foot pulsed with human and animal life, where waste management was a concept, not a practice, and where the air hung thick with 1,000 competing odours. The streets, as we briefly touched upon, were the main arteries of urban life, and also its most prominent sewers. Not just the garde-lou from above, but the daily accumulation of refuse from every household and every trade. Butcher shops would discard entrails directly into the street. Tanneries, essential for leather but notorious for their stench, would process hides using urine and animal waste, with their effluvium often flowing freely into public spaces. Fishmongers left their scraps. People and animals relieved themselves wherever convenient. The problem was simple. There were too many people and not enough infrastructure to handle their output. Rivers, if a city was lucky enough to have one, became glorified open drains, carrying away the city's waste but also polluting its water supply further downstream. Wells, dug within the city limits, were often contaminated by seepage from cesspits and overflowing gutters. Drinking water was a gamble, as always. This pervasive stench, a complex bouquet of human and animal waste smoke, unwashed bodies, rotting food and industrial effluvia, permeated everything. It clung to clothes, seeped into homes and became the constant background to urban existence. You didn't just smell a medieval city, you felt it, tasted it, and through it all, residents developed that highly practical nose blindness we discussed earlier. It was a matter of survival, a form of sensory adaptation. To actively smell everything all the time would have driven one to madness. Despite the filth, medieval cities hummed with life. Markets bustled, merchants haggled, artisans plied their trades, guilds formed, building magnificent halls, churches soared skyward, symbols of faith and civic pride. Yet, beneath this veneer of vibrant activity, the underlying reality remained. The medieval city was an environmental disaster waiting to happen. The outbreaks of plague and other diseases which periodically decimated urban populations weren't just random acts of God. They were often the grim, inevitable consequence of living in such close, unsanitary quarters. So, while tales of bustling markets and towering cathedrals might capture the imagination, the true experience of a medieval city was far more visceral. It was a place of opportunity, yes, but also a relentless assault on the senses, a triumph of human resilience over an environment that was, frankly, trying its best to kill you with its smell. From the putrid chaos of the city streets, let's now transport ourselves to the supposed height of medieval luxury, the feast. Surely this was a moment of unbridled indulgence, a culinary escape from the daily grind and the ever-present stench. And in some ways, it was. But it was also a testament to medieval indigestion, gluttony, and a complete disregard for anything resembling a balanced diet. For the nobility, a feast was a statement, a dazzling display of wealth, power, and prestige. It wasn't just about food, it was about spectacle. Tablecloths, if used, were a sign of extreme sophistication. Silverware was rare. People ate mostly with knives, spoons, and their hands, often sharing trenchers, stale bread slices that served as plates and were later given to the poor. The sheer volume of food was staggering. Course after course would be presented, often with dramatic flair. Roasted peacocks redressed in their feathers, boars' heads with apples in their mouths, elaborate subtleties, sugar sculptures depicting castles or mythological scenes. And meats, so much meat. Venison, pork, beef, swan, heron, endless birds and beasts, all roasted, boiled, or stewed into oblivion. Now, for digestion. The medieval palate was used to heavy, rich, fatty foods. Vegetables beyond root vegetables were often seen as peasant fare, or were simply limited by season. Fruit was consumed, but often after the meal, and could be quite exotic if imported. The problem wasn't just the quantity, it was the preparation. Spices, while expensive, were used to mask the taste of not-so-fresh meat, or simply to show off the host's wealth. Many dishes were overloaded with fat, honey, and dense pastries. The result? Let's just say medieval intestines had a serious job to do. Without modern understanding of food hygiene, and with food often prepared hours or even days in advance without refrigeration, food poisoning was a constant shadow. After a particularly lavish feast, it was common for guests to retire to their chambers and, shall we say, purge themselves, not out of guilt but out of necessity. Vomiting was a socially acceptable way to make room for the next course, or to relieve the intense discomfort of overindulgence. Bowls would be discreetly placed near the table for such occasions, and the aftermath? The sheer amount of waste generated by a medieval feast was immense. Carcasses, discarded bones, uneaten trenchers, and the general mess of drunken revelry often ended up on the floor, to be picked over by dogs, or, if unlucky, to be cleaned up by servants. The air, already thick with the scent of roasted meat and spilled ale, would soon acquire a new layer, the subtle aroma of decomposition. So, while the image of a grand medieval feast might conjure up visions of merriment and abundance, the reality was often a testament to human gluttony, the limits of the medieval digestive system, and a profound lack of concern for subsequent hygiene. It was a glorious display of excess, where the only thing perhaps more impressive than the food itself was the sheer willpower, or lack thereof, required to consume it. From the post-feast stupor, let's turn our attention to another fascinating, if often uncomfortable aspect of medieval life: fashion. Unlike today's trends that prioritize comfort, breathability, and often revealing as much skin as possible, medieval fashion was a masterclass in layering, social display, and an almost complete disregard for personal ease. For both men and women, the basic silhouette was long, flowing, and relatively shapeless for the lower classes. Underwear, if worn, was a simple linen shift or braise, loose trousers for men. Over this, multiple layers of tunics, gowns, and robes were added. The fabric, wool for the common folk, linen for underlayers, and silk, velvet, or brocade for the wealthy, dictated both your comfort and your status. Think about it. Scratchy wool, worn for weeks without washing, clinging to your skin, the constant friction, the sweat. the delightful ecosystem of fleas and lice that found a cosy home within the folds of your garments. Medieval fashion was less about looking chic and more about keeping warm, displaying wealth, and adhering to strict social codes. For the nobility, fashion was a rigid system of sumptuary laws. These unwritten, and sometimes written, rules dictated what you could wear based on your social class, income, and even profession. The richness of your fabric, the extravagance of your furs, the vibrancy of your dyes, all screamed your status to anyone who cared to look. Purple, for instance, was often reserved for royalty, a colour so rare and expensive to produce that merely wearing it solidified your position at the top of the social hierarchy. To wear the wrong colour, or too many layers for your station, could result in fines, public humiliation, or worse. Elaborate hairstyles, often covered with veils, wimples, or towering hen-ins. Those cone-shaped hats for women were common among the wealthy. Men sported meticulously groomed beards, often curled and oiled, which were not just facial hair but a badge of masculinity and wisdom. Accessories were laden with meaning: rings, necklaces, brooches, often functional, used to fasten cloaks, and belts all served as markers of status, wealth, or spiritual devotion. But perhaps the most striking aspect of medieval fashion was its sheer impracticality for anything other than sitting, standing, or very, very slow walking. Gowns could weigh a significant amount, especially if heavily embroidered or made of thick brocade. Pointy shoes, fashionable for men, made navigation difficult, and the sheer volume of fabric meant that any strenuous activity was almost impossible without looking like a crumpled bedsheet. So, while medieval fashion might appear visually stunning through the lens of art history, the lived experience was often one of stifling layers, constant itching, and an underlying sense of discomfort. It was a powerful tool for social display, but one that demanded a significant sacrifice of personal ease, and certainly didn't do much to alleviate the ambient scent of the wearer after a long, unwashed day. If your daily life was a relentless torrent of physical discomfort, social stricture, and questionable hygiene, your understanding of the universe provided a different kind of confinement. The medieval cosmos was a rigid, ordered, and intensely personal place, often a source of both profound comfort and existential terror. Forget the vast, expanding universe of endless galaxies and dark matter. In the Middle Ages, the cosmos was a neatly packaged, geocentric model. Earth was the unmoving centre, a fixed point upon which everything else revolved. Around it spun crystalline spheres, each carrying a celestial body: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Beyond Saturn lay the sphere of the fixed stars, and then the Empyrean, the realm of God, angels, and pure, unwavering light. This wasn't just a scientific theory, it was a theological truth. The universe was God's orderly creation, a perfectly harmonious clockwork designed for humanity's benefit, or perhaps for its testing. Every movement of the planets, every twinkling star was a testament to divine order. So when life was chaotic, dirty and short, at least the heavens provided a sense of divine purpose, a cosmic certainty. But this certainty also came with its own anxieties. The stars weren't just pretty lights, they held influence. Astrology, far from being a fringe belief, was a serious intellectual pursuit, practiced by scholars and consulted by kings. Your birth chart, the alignment of the planets at the moment you entered this messy world, was believed to influence your temperament, your fortunes, and even your health. A bad planetary alignment could explain a failed harvest, a sudden fever, or an unfortunately common rash. Comets, eclipses, and other celestial phenomena were not just natural occurrences. They were omens, portents, signs from God, or sometimes the devil, warning of impending doom, famine, plague, or the death of a king. Imagine seeing a celestial event and immediately wondering if God was personally annoyed with your village's collective sins, or if the universe was about to drop another dose of misery, like a failed harvest or the return of the Black Death right on your doorstep. The sky, then, was an active participant in daily life. Farmers looked to the phases of the moon for planting. Sailors relied on stars for navigation, though less scientifically than modern methods. And every person, from peasant to king, lived under the watchful, influencing eye of a fixed yet constantly signalling firmament. Your place in the world was literally mapped onto the heavens. You were small, fixed, and infinitely susceptible to the vast, cold, and divine forces that spun just beyond your sight. There was majesty, yes, but also a profound, humbling sense of your own insignificance in the grand, divinely orchestrated cosmic dance. From the grand, unfeeling expanse of the cosmos, let us return to the slightly more contained, yet equally complex universe of the medieval feast. We've covered the questionable food and the communal vomiting. Now, let's peel back the layers on what happened after the plates, or trenchers, were cleared. Because a medieval feast wasn't just about eating, it was a meticulously choreographed social event, often punctuated by entertainment that would make a modern audience either cringe or scratch their heads in utter confusion. First, the setting. Great halls, often drafty and dimly lit even with hundreds of candles, would be alive with noise. The clatter of eating, the shouts of servants, the barking of dogs, who were often allowed to roam freely and clean up fallen scraps, and the chatter of guests. Social hierarchy was rigidly enforced even at the table. The lord and lady sat at a high table, often on a dais, looking down upon their guests who were seated according to their status. The further down the table you were, the lower your social standing and likely the worse the food. Now for the entertainment. This wasn't Netflix. Oh no. The primary form of after-dinner amusement was storytelling. Bards, minstrels, and troubadours would perform ballads, epic poems, often incredibly long and prone to exaggeration, and moralizing tales. These weren't just for fun, they served to educate, to spread news, often biased, mind you, and to uphold the heroic ideals of the age. Imagine sitting through hours of a sung account of a battle you might have actually fought in, listening to the minstrel dramatically embellish your own bravery. But intellectual entertainment wasn't the only kind. Jesters, often with physical deformities or a sharp wit, or both, would provide comic relief, sometimes at the expense of guests. Acrobats, jugglers, and even animal trainers would perform. Bear baiting, a deeply disturbing spectacle where chained bears were attacked by dogs, was a surprisingly common form of entertainment, horrifying to our modern sensibilities, but utterly normal then. Sometimes the entertainment was even more specialised. A wandering magician might perform rudimentary tricks, or a fire eater ignite the air, hoping not to set the hall ablaze. The conversation, flowing alongside the entertainment and copious amounts of wine and ale, was also a performance. Guests were expected to engage in witty banter, tell tall tales, and subtly jockey for social position. Gossip was a vital currency, and the rise and fall of reputations could be sealed at the dinner table. And for those who overindulged in wine or food, discretion was often key. While open vomiting at the table was not universally approved, it was understood. Public displays of drunkenness, however, were less about quiet shame and more about riotous behaviour. Feasts could often devolve into unruly affairs, with arguments, brawls, and even the occasional duel breaking out amidst the leftover trenchers. So, a medieval feast, far from a sedate dining experience, was a theatrical production, a social arena, and a digestive challenge all rolled into one. It was a place where alliances were forged, reputations were won and lost, and the sheer human capacity for endurance, both physical and performative, was put to the ultimate test. And as the night wore on and the torches guttered, the underlying stench of food, bodies, and stale ale would once again begin to assert its dominance, ensuring that even in the height of revelry, the grim realities were never far away. From the relative and often stifling comfort of the Great Hall, let's now envision ourselves experiencing another fundamental aspect of medieval life: travel. Forget hopping on a plane, cruising down a paved highway, or even enjoying the smooth ride of a modern train. A medieval road trip was a brutal, arduous, and frankly very smelly undertaking, a test of endurance, faith, and your ability to tolerate constant discomfort. Roads, if they existed at all, were rarely paved beyond city gates. They were often little more than well-worn dirt tracks, frequently rutted by cartwheels, churned into mud by rain, or dusty plains under the sun. They were shared with everything: merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, beggars, livestock, and the occasional runaway serf. It was a slow, agonising process. A journey of 20 miles could take a full day, or more, depending on the weather and the terrain. The primary mode of transport for most was, of course, your own 2 feet. Walking. If you were lucky, you had a cart or a pack animal to carry your meagre belongings. Horses were for the wealthy, for knights and nobles, and even then riding for hours on end was an intensely physical experience, leading to chafing, saddle sores, and an all-pervasive layer of road dust mixed with sweat. Then there was the constant background awareness of danger. Robbers lurked in forests and along lonely stretches of road. Feudal lords might demand tolls for passage through their lands. Wild animals, as we discussed, were not to be trifled with. Every journey was a calculated risk, a gamble with life and limb, and the hygiene. Days, weeks, or even months on the road meant a complete abandonment of any semblance of personal cleanliness. Bathing was impossible. Clothes remained unwashed, absorbing every layer of sweat, dust, and roadside effluvia. The roadside inns, where travellers huddled for the night, were notorious for their filth, bedbugs, and dangerously watered-down ale. Imagine sharing a communal room with dozens of unwashed strangers, all emitting their own unique ambience, surrounded by the constant hum of flies. Sleep was a restless, fitful affair, punctuated by snoring, scratching, and the distant sounds of the night. The food, too, was basic and monotonous. Dried meat, hard bread, and whatever boiled gruel the innkeeper could provide. Water, again, was a constant concern. You prayed for clean springs, but often had to risk suspicious puddles or the stale offerings of a wayside well. Yet, despite all this discomfort and danger, people travelled. They undertook pilgrimages to holy sites, went on crusades, sought trade, delivered messages, or simply moved from one famine-stricken area to another. There was a unique camaraderie among travellers, a shared understanding of the hardships and the occasional small miracles, a clean spring, a surprisingly decent inn, a moment of unexpected kindness from a stranger. So, while modern travel might involve screaming toddlers and endless security lines, remember your medieval ancestors traversed actual nightmares of mud, potential bandits, and omnipresent stench, all for the sake of faith, coin, or simply putting one foot in front of the other. It was a journey not for the faint of heart, or the sensitive of nose, and every arrival, no matter how humble, was a hard-won victory against the elements, the odds, and the constant, overwhelming smell of the road. After a long, arduous journey along the mud-choked, bandit-ridden medieval roads, the sight of an inn, however humble, would have been a beacon of hope. Forget the gleaming, standardised hotels and quaint B&Bs of today. A medieval inn was a chaotic, often filthy, but ultimately necessary nexus of tired travellers, overflowing stables and questionable hygiene. Picture this. You stumble through the door, your clothes thick with dust or mud, your stomach growling and your body aching. The interior is likely dim, smoky from a perpetually burning hearth, and filled with a cacophony of sounds. Loud conversation, clattering tankards, the braying of donkeys from the adjacent stable, and the pervasive buzz of flies. The air is a rich tapestry of smells: stale ale, horse manure, unwashed bodies, and the faint, unidentifiable aroma of something cooking that you really hope is not a rat. Lodging was usually communal. Privacy was a concept reserved for nobles in their castles. You'd sleep in a shared room, or even just on a communal straw-strewn floor, with a dozen or more strangers. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and sundry vagabonds would be crammed together. The bedding, if any, often consisted of straw mattresses, replete with their own unique ecosystems of fleas, bedbugs, and the occasional mouse, and rough woolen blankets that hadn't seen a washing day since Michaelmas. If you were lucky, you'd get a wooden pillow. If you were really lucky, it wouldn't have active residents. The concept of a private bath was laughable. Washing, if it happened at all, involved a basin of cold water and a communal cloth. The privy, as we well know, would be an outhouse, a hole in the ground, or a designated area out back, probably already overflowing and attracting more flies than you thought possible. Food was basic and repetitive. A stew, likely pottage, thick and hearty enough to fill a protesting belly, but made from ingredients that bordered on the suspicious. Bread, hard and often stale, would be served in generous quantities. And of course, the ever-present ale, served in tankards that saw more use than washing. It filled you up, kept you hydrated and slightly tipsy, and momentarily dulled the ache in your joints. Entertainment in the inn might be provided by a travelling minstrel, a jester, or simply by the colourful and potentially dangerous characters who populated the common room. Arguments, brawls, and even outright robberies were not uncommon. The innkeeper, a figure of authority, or desperate neutrality, would have seen it all, and likely developed a thick skin and an even thicker purse as a result. And yet, despite the discomfort, the noise, the questionable hygiene, and the ever-present possibility of violent altercation, the medieval inn was a vital artery of medieval life. It offered shelter from the elements, a much-needed break from the relentless road, and the illusion of safety behind its rough-hewn doors. It was a place where news was exchanged, deals were struck, and weary travellers could, for a few precious hours, forget the gnawing discomfort of their bodies and the dangers that lay waiting just beyond the stable yard. It wasn't luxury, but in a world that seldom offered it, it was enough. From the ephemeral comfort of the inn, let's turn to perhaps one of the most perilous rites of passage in medieval life: childbirth. Forget epidurals, sterile environments, or concerned doctors with years of training. In the Middle Ages, bringing a new life into the world was a dangerous gamble, a moment of profound vulnerability for both mother and child, often fraught with pain, prayer, and the ever-present spectre of death. If you were a woman in medieval Europe, your life path was, in many ways, defined by your ability to bear children. Marriage happened early, often in your mid to late teens, and the expectation to produce heirs, particularly sons, followed swiftly. Without any reliable birth control, pregnancy was a frequent, almost constant state during a woman's reproductive years. This meant that the risks of childbirth weren't abstract. They were recurrent and very real. The birth typically occurred at home, attended not by a trained physician, but by midwives. These were experienced women from the community, possessing a wealth of practical knowledge passed down through generations. They understood the rhythms of birth, the signs of trouble, and the importance of prayer. Their tools were simple: warm water, clean linens, as clean as they could be, and herbal remedies to ease pain or speed labour. The atmosphere would have been one of hushed tension, punctuated by moans of pain and fervent prayers. Women were typically attended by other women, close family, neighbours, and the midwife. Men, especially husbands, were usually excluded from the birthing chamber, their role limited to pacing outside and praying fervently for a good outcome. The dangers were immense: prolonged labour, hemorrhage, infection. Puerperal fever, often caused by unsanitary conditions and unwashed hands, was a leading killer, and obstructed births were common. Without the medical interventions we take for granted today, C-sections, forceps, antibiotics, complications that are easily managed now were often fatal for both mother and child. Some women might survive 10 or more pregnancies, a testament to sheer resilience. Many did not survive even one. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high. Infant mortality was equally grim. Even if the mother survived delivery, the newborn faced its own gauntlet. Disease, malnourishment, and the harsh realities of medieval life often claimed nearly half of all children before their 5th birthday. For a medieval family, every surviving child was a hard-won victory against overwhelming odds. So, while we might view childbirth today with a sense of wonder and anticipation, for the medieval woman it was a reoccurring encounter with the edge of mortality. It was a testament to unimaginable strength, a profound act of faith, and a constant reminder of the fragility of life in a world where every new breath was a miracle. And for the child who managed to cling to life, a whole new set of uncomfortable realities awaited. Having covered the intensely personal trials of childbirth and the communal chaos of the inn, let's wind down with another staple of medieval social life that was probably a lot more appealing than many of the other experiences we've discussed: the tavern. Forget sleek, well-lit bars with craft cocktails. A medieval tavern was a rough-and-tumble establishment, a smoky, noisy haven where social distinctions blurred, and the primary lubricant was ale, served in copious quantities. The tavern was the social hub for many. It was a place for men, and sometimes women, though their presence could be viewed suspiciously, to gather after a long day of labour, to escape the confines of their cramped homes and to engage in conversation, gossip, and raucous revelry. It served multiple purposes beyond just serving drinks. It was a centre for news and rumours, a place to strike deals, and sometimes a convenient venue for clandestine meetings or less than legal activities. The star of the show was, of course, ale. Beer brewing was a household activity, and every tavern would brew its own. This ale was probably thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol content, making it a viable alternative to questionable water sources. It was drunk by the gallon, often by all ages from dawn till dusk. Wine was available, but usually for the well-to-do or on special occasions. Spirits, like whiskey or brandy, were rare and considered medicinal. The interior of a medieval tavern would have been rustic at best. Rough wooden tables and benches, a perpetually burning hearth providing warmth and smoke, and perhaps a few flickering candles or oil lamps offering dim illumination. The floors would be strewn with rushes, meant to absorb spills and waste, but often simply contributing to the overall malodorous bouquet. The walls, if not plastered, would be bare stone or timber, etched with the passage of countless hands and the echoes of endless conversations. The clientele would be a mix of local peasants, travelling merchants, artisans, and perhaps a stray soldier or two. Social hierarchies were less rigid than in other settings, partially due to the intoxicating effects of the ale, and partially due to the shared desire for camaraderie and escape. Stories were told, songs were sung, dice were rolled, and arguments, sometimes leading to brawls, were frequent. Hygiene, as you might expect, was an afterthought. Tankards were probably just rinsed, not thoroughly cleaned. The general atmosphere was one of unwashed bodies, spilled drinks, and the heavy aroma of humanity. The privies, if any, would be rudimentary at best, located outside and rarely maintained. And yet, for all its grime and chaos, the medieval tavern offered something vital, a temporary escape from the crushing realities of medieval life. It was a place where worries could be drowned in a tankard, where friendships could be forged, and where, for a few precious hours, the relentless discomforts of the outside world could be forgotten amidst the haze of ale and fellowship. It was a rough diamond, yes, but a diamond nonetheless, shining dimly in the very dim world of medieval daily existence. From the convivial and financially draining atmosphere of the medieval tavern, let us now contemplate a grim reality faced by nearly everyone in the Middle Ages: the state of their wallet. Forget credit cards, bank accounts, or even a dependable flow of cash. For most medieval people, personal finance was a relentless, precarious dance on the edge of destitution, a constant battle against hunger, debt, and the seemingly arbitrary whims of fate. Money, as we understand it today, was a concept still very much in flux. Coins existed, but their value could fluctuate wildly based on the reigning monarch, the purity of the metal, and the general economic health of the region. Barter was often more common, especially in rural areas. You exchange your surplus oats for your neighbour's eggs, or your weaving for a blacksmith's repair. This made long-term planning, savings, and large purchases incredibly difficult. For the vast majority, the peasants, everything revolved around the harvest. Your entire year's income, your family's survival, hinged on the success of the crops. A good harvest meant relative security for a few months. A bad one meant starvation, debt, and desperation. And the harvest was, of course, entirely at the mercy of the weather, which, as we've learned, was not always cooperative. Too much rain, too little rain, a late frost, an early blight. Any of these could wipe out a family's entire economic foundation. Taxes were ubiquitous and ruthless. You owed a portion of your harvest, your labour, your animals, and sometimes even your entire person to the local lord. The church demanded tithes, a tenth of everything. Beyond these formal obligations, there were countless informal ones: fines for minor infractions, tolls for using roads or bridges, and obligatory gifts to those higher up the social ladder. It was a constant outflow, and for most the inflow was barely enough to keep pace. Debt was a constant shadow. If the harvest failed, or sickness struck, or a cow died, a peasant might have to borrow from the very lord who already demanded so much. These loans came with crushing interest rates, trapping families in cycles of perpetual indebtedness that could last generations. The concept of bankruptcy as a fresh start simply did not exist. Unpaid debt could lead to serfdom, imprisonment, or even servitude. Even for artisans and merchants in the towns, economic life was precarious. While they dealt more with coin, they faced their own challenges: guild regulations, intense competition, and the constant threat of theft. Their fortunes often rose and fell with the flow of trade, which could be disrupted by wars, famines, or outbreaks of plague. Savings in our modern sense were almost impossible for the poor. Any surplus was usually transformed into something tangible, an extra sack of grain, a new tool, an additional animal. There were no financial advisors, no retirement plans, no safety nets beyond the fragile bonds of family and community. And even those could fray under the relentless pressure of want. So, while medieval life might seem simple in its lack of modern complications, the struggle for economic survival was anything but. It was a grinding daily reality, a constant state of precarity where a single misstep or stroke of bad luck could send an entire family spiralling into irreversible destitution. Your medieval wallet was often empty, a testament to a system designed to extract every last ounce of labour and produce, leaving just enough for a bitter but hopefully not fatal survival. Having delved into the eternal emptiness of the medieval purse, let's now consider the physical embodiment of that precarious financial state. The medieval home. Forget sprawling suburban houses or even compact urban apartments. Your medieval abode, if you were a peasant, was a microcosm of survival, a testament to ingenuity born of scarcity, and a place where privacy was a whispered legend, not a daily reality. Most peasant homes were small, single-room structures. They were built from whatever local materials were cheapest and most readily available: wood, mud, and straw. The most common construction technique was wattle and daub. Imagine a framework of woven branches and sticks, the wattle, then smeared liberally with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and yes, often animal dung, the daub. This created surprisingly sturdy, if not exactly aesthetically pleasing, walls. The dung component wasn't for charm. It was a cheap, sticky binder and an insulator. Roofs were typically thatched, thick layers of straw, reeds, or heather. Picturesque perhaps from a distance, but up close, they were prone to leaks, rot, and often served as attractive nesting sites for rodents, insects, and the occasional bird. Nothing says pleasant evening like a mouse dropping from the ceiling onto your boiled turnip. Windows, if they existed at all, were tiny unglazed openings, often covered with a simple wooden shutter, a piece of animal hide, or a tightly woven cloth. Glass was an expensive luxury, far beyond the reach of the common folk. So, light was precious, and draught was inevitable. The floors were almost universally compacted dirt, stamped hard over years of human and animal traffic. In wet weather, they could become muddy quagmires, and in winter they radiated a bone-chilling cold that seeped into everything. The interior was sparse. Furnishings were minimal: a rough wooden table, a few stools or benches, and perhaps a large chest for storing what few possessions you had. Beds, as we've discussed, were often nothing more than straw-filled sacks or piles of hay. There was little in the way of storage, no closets, no pantries. Everything was open, visible, and generally accessible to anyone who entered. The central feature, both physically and functionally, was the hearth. A simple fire pit in the middle of the room, often with just a hole in the roof above it to let out the smoke. It served as your kitchen, your heat source, your light, and the social hub of the home. Smoke, however, was as much a feature as the fire itself. It permeated everything, coating the walls, your clothes, and your lungs in a layer of soot. Constant exposure to smoke contributed significantly to respiratory illnesses, but without it, you wouldn't survive the winter. Privacy was virtually non-existent. A single room meant everyone shared the space. Parents, children, perhaps a grandparent, along with livestock, shared warmth, remember? Every conversation, every bodily function, every moment of rest or activity was communal. Personal boundaries were fluid, defined not by walls but by unwritten social codes, and the sheer necessity of surviving in close quarters. So, while tales of bustling markets and towering cathedrals might fill the history books, the intimate reality of medieval life was often condensed into these small, smoky and overcrowded dwellings. They were not monuments to status or comfort, but gritty, practical capsules of survival, where ingenuity and sheer endurance were more valuable than any architectural flourish. And within these walls, life unfolded in an unending cycle of labour, shared meals, and the constant, inescapable presence of families and farm animals.